I'm not proud of the joke that cost me my husband. I don't even know how to start this, but I'll try. It was a joke, at least I thought it was. He obviously didn't think so, and that eventually led to me losing everything I've worked so hard for. Let me tell you about it. As it turned out, it was a very expensive joke. Hello Reddit, my name is Shimmer and I'm 26 years old. I'm a model. My mother loved anything that shone, which eventually led to my father's bankruptcy and me having to pay them all off. My mother was born into a wealthy family and she was the only child, so she was spoiled. Anything she wanted was hers for the taking, and she took advantage of that fact a lot to taunt people around her. Her father had some issues with his company. He had taken out a loan to invest enough capital into a business, which eventually failed. That made him fall into loads of debt, which meant he couldn't sponsor my mother's luxurious lifestyle. My grandfather died in debt, and everything he owned was seized to make up for it. My mother couldn't bear the idea of living as a poor girl, so she seduced my father, who was 22 years her senior. She got pregnant, and my father, who was widowed with 2 sons, had no choice but to marry her. He paid off the rest of the debt. My grandfather left behind, and he kept sponsoring my mother's luxurious lifestyle until he went bankrupt. His 2 sons, my stepbrothers, are much older than me, because their own mother died a long time ago before my father remarried. My mom refused to have anything to do with paying back my father's debts because they knew that they were acquired from growing up. I had to support my mother's lifestyle, which was pretty exhausting. She wanted me to dress a certain way, eat in an elegant manner, and basically show how well-bred I was. I was a fat baby, which displeased my mother, who wanted a thin, sexy, beautiful child. She would feed me less and say I was underweight. I was helped to lose weight, and got so used to it that if I ate more, I would throw up. My mother wanted me to be a model, and had always wanted to be one herself. She was slim and never got the chance, so she was prepared to make sure I got the chance. I have been learning how to model since I was able to speak perfect English and walk without stumbling. My mother paid people to put me in ads on TV and in magazines. Even as a child, I lived my mother's dream. When my father went bankrupt and couldn't support her, she sent me to live with her cousin, Raya. She was kind and treated me like I wasn't under scrutiny. She let me choose what I wanted to eat and wear. She let me choose what I ate, and let me pick my clothes and hairstyle. I loved living with her so much that I never wanted to leave. But eventually my father died, and I was called back home for his funeral. My mother was very dramatic, and ran towards the grave and the coffin being put in it. She threw herself over the grave, and asked that she be buried with my father. I knew it was all an act though, so people would think she loved him a lot, despite the age difference. Another reason I didn't cry was because my father and I weren't close. We didn't have that father-daughter bond that everyone else seemed to have. He was mostly after pleasing my mother and never paid much attention to me. I didn't get much attention from my dad. In fact, I made sure I wasn't around when he was. After my father passed away, my mom called me and said she was unhappy with my weight gain. She made me start training and dieting because she thought I was going to be the next family food ticket. I had to be good enough even though I was underage because of my shape and height. That was the only thing I got from my dad. I was modeling for a lot of things, both for teenagers and even adults. My mother was my manager. She screamed at everyone I met and everything I did. I didn't have any friends. Let me rephrase that. I wasn't allowed to have friends because according to my mother, they were just mere distractions. She didn't want me to be distracted. I was so distracted that I didn't even get to soil my dress and be scolded lovingly by my mother. Instead, I received lectures on how perfect I should be and how I couldn't make any mistakes, given how young I was. I was modeling lingerie for stores and they sold lots because of me. I was young, flashy, and had fine skin and legs that went on and on. I was also bullied because of my looks at school. It's funny because I was surprised to find that an ugly person or a nerd would be bullied in school. But that a girl being bullied because she was a model was also a possibility. One time, a classmate called Chloe had called me names at school, and I had been so upset that I told my mother once I was back home. She just shrugged her shoulders and told me that I would probably hear worse things than that, and that I should toughen up, because once I did, then no one would be able to break my skin again. I did as she asked. I toughened up, became the girl my mother wanted me to be. Perfect, beautiful, flawless. Chloe's words or anyone else's didn't mean anything to me anymore. I was Shimmer. Then I got a contract with the biggest modeling agency, the one my mother had always wanted to work with. My mother was more excited than I was about the whole thing. I was happy, of course, but only because she was happy. There was this one time I went for an interview for a modeling job, and the director in charge had offered to have sex with me in exchange for the job. I was so horrified, I had slapped him hard across the face and walked out. When I got home, I told my mother what had happened. She had screamed and shouted at me, asking me why I had refused since it was just a one-off. I was so shocked by what my mother had said, but I ignored it and carried on with my schooling and modeling jobs. One day I decided to come home from school earlier than usual because I was feeling sick. I remember the school nurse calling to tell my mom about my illness, but my mom hadn't picked up any of the calls. Eventually, the school nurse I had to go home because I was feeling unwell. When I got home, I heard moaning sounds and followed them to my mother's room, where I found her in bed with my eldest stepbrother, Dan. I was shocked and gasped loudly, but they were too involved to notice me. When I confronted my mother about her affair, she dismissed it as nothing and told me. She said that her husband was dead and she was still young, so why not have a young man to warm her bed, especially since he was family too. I was really disgusted by her thoughts and actions. Even now, I wonder what caused my father's quick death. If it wasn't her cheating, I never found out. After the incident with my mother and Dan, I worked harder than ever before so I could go to college and leave the woman's clutches behind. After high school, I got into music. I wasn't that into it, but my agent suggested it so I could also get familiar with it, because they wanted me to start acting in films too. I didn't mind because I just wanted to do anything except stay with my mom during my college days. I also did some modeling on the side to get money to pay my bills. Before long, I found it was much easier to exploit. Men, young and old, were drawn to me because of my looks. It was easy to live the lifestyle I'd always wanted, thanks to my mother's teachings. I didn't visit her once during my college years. I didn't want her to know I was living the lifestyle I'd always despised. I stayed in school to avoid her, and when there were holidays I spent them in clubs. I even started dancing at the famous club, but no one knew me because I used loads of makeup to cover up my real face, and also wore a mask when I was dancing. I know what you're all thinking, but I didn't sleep with any man at the club, except for one. His name was Marvel, and he was my first boyfriend and friend. He was the one who introduced me to that club because he worked there as their manager. When he realized I could dance, he convinced me to dance for fun. I didn't know he was collecting money from the men who watched me dance. I just felt I was dancing for fun. Well, that was until Marvel started telling me to strip a little for the men who came to watch me. He just wanted to tease them for fun. At first I found it strange, but I wanted to please Marvel so much that I did what he asked. Eventually though, he wanted me to start revealing my face and stripping, and I refused. I ended things with him because I knew if I continued down that path, my day job as a model would be over before it even began. I concentrated on modeling and my course in music. I stopped collecting money from men for the fun of it because I realized I was becoming like my mother. I should mention that not once did she call when I was in college to check up on me. She never rang me to see how I was. I didn't want to end up like my mother when I finished college. I got a major deal to model for an international company. I was also given an all-expenses-paid trip to their headquarters in another state, so I could understand clearly the product I was modeling for. I was really excited and packed my bags and went on the trip. It was there I met Austin. Austin happened to be the owner of the international company I was modeling for. He was way older than me, but I was happy he was interested in me. Austin took an interest in me. He was originally 11 years older than me, but that didn't matter when I fell in love with him. I hadn't had any feelings for Austin at first, but he was so easy to love that I was already head over heels before I realized he was sweet and gentle. He knew how to make good conversation. We spoke for hours on end most times, and even if we had nothing to say, he would come up with something that would eventually lead to us talking for another hour or two. Despite being very wealthy, he was humble, and it was clear that all his workers adored him. When Austin asked me to be his girlfriend, I was super excited and said yes, almost immediately. We started dating, and within 2 months of dating we got married. Our relationship was short, but we both knew what we wanted, and as Austin would say, I never waste time with something I know is for me, which is what makes me a very rich businessman. Austin was one man that I knew had very sharp instincts, and whenever he listened to them, he always ended up being right about anything. My mother was more excited than I was when we got married. She thought that my husband would sponsor her luxurious lifestyle like her father did. In the end, it ruined him and my mother. My father ended up the same way. I wasn't going to let her do that to my husband, so I refused to invite her to the wedding. She was angry, but I didn't mind. I was done playing her little games. She used me as a pawn or bait to get whatever she wanted. Luckily for her, I managed to convince her not to abandon me, so we put her on a strict monthly allowance. She was pretty mad about that because she was used to having unlimited access to money, but I didn't care. I was happy being married to Austin because I loved him and he loved me too. I didn't stop working as a model though, not because of the money, but because I loved being a model. Austin was very supportive of my work and would even employ me to work with his company from time to time. Whenever I refused payment, he would insist it was for the job I did and pay me. He was always really nice to me and made sure that despite his busy schedule, he had time for me. I loved that about him. One time I had to work in another city and he was really busy, so I couldn't tell him about it. I went alone, and after settling in and starting the photography sessions, I saw him with the media crew waiting for me. I was so happy and proud that my husband supported my job so much. He would always make time for me. Throughout our first 2 years of marriage, we never had any major arguments. That night, I was called home by my stepbrother Ben. He was the only one I spoke to after seeing my mom and Dan together. I never spoke to him again, and since I got married, my mom has also been on the list of people I don't speak to. She's tried several times to get in touch, but I've told the security not to let her in. I don't want to see or talk to her at all. Ben told me she died in a car accident. She'd been drunk and had a head-on collision. I went home to fulfill my duties as her only child after she died in a collision with a truck carrying wood. Austin couldn't go with me because he had meetings he couldn't walk away from. I went alone and arranged her burial ceremony. Many people turned up and had a lot of good things to say about her. I knew it was all a charade. They just wanted to come see me, whether or not I turned out like my mother. Only a few of them knew I was married to Austin. I fired everyone as quickly as I could because I was exhausted from having to pretend to be a daughter who cared about her mother. The person I saw last was the most shocking. It was Chloe. She looked like she had swallowed a ball and a man. A very handsome man had been holding her hand. Her hand was outstretched as she walked towards me, offering her obviously fake condolences. I had prepared to give her a cold remark, whatever she said, since I knew what she was there for. By that time, the young gentleman had released her hand and gone in search of someone in the room. After offering me his condolences, she smiled again after he left and rubbed her stomach, offering me her condolences. I just smiled back and said thank you. The strange thing was that she started chatting with me like we were old friends and told me that she was 6 months gone and couldn't even wait for She also told me she was expecting a baby and wanted to have her wedding in September to fit in her wedding dress. She also mentioned that she'd started working as a school teacher at our old high school and that her boyfriend was a model, but he hadn't been able to get any good gigs recently, so things had been tight, especially with the baby on the way. That's all I heard. From all the nonsense she was spouting at the time, I got the impression that she wasn't married to the guy who turned out to be called Harris and who was a model. It seemed like the ideal moment to get back at Chloe for what she'd done in high school, so I smiled and offered to help Harris out with a job she'd been really happy about, without her knowing that I was behind it. I had a plan. My original plan was to employ Harris and take him far away from Chloe as a big punishment for what she did to me in high school. Or I could keep him so busy he would barely have time for her. So I got him loads of modeling jobs, which I was the manager of. I told Austin that I had business to settle, so I had to stay back a while, and he reluctantly agreed because he couldn't come because of work. I made sure I worked Harris to the bone, and he was pretty exhausted by the end of the day. Whether the picture was fine or not, I had him pose over 100 times again, and eventually chose the ones he had done before. Chloe came to see me and asked if I could lighten Harris's workload because he never had time for her. With the baby on the way, she was stressed. I just reminded her that she'd asked me to give him a chance and that Harris wasn't the best out there. I only started the project because I accepted her request since we were old friends. Chloe had agreed and left my place looking like a bag of potatoes. I remember being happy to see her like that, and I even toasted to the air with my most expensive wine. I continued making Harris pay for Chloe's sins, and I guessed he must have noticed. He came to me one time and asked why I'd been so hard on him and treated him poorly. I realized I'd been so caught up in my revenge that another human was suffering for it. I apologized and he asked if he could join me for dinner as a truce. I agreed and ordered us food to eat since I couldn't cook, but Harris had asked me to cancel the order and said he'd cook. I was surprised at how much he knew about cooking, but he did a great job. Harris was really good with the knives and everything else. By the time an hour had passed, dinner was ready, and it was delicious. We talked for a while and found out that we had similar interests. We had a lot in common, so we had a great conversation when he left. He offered to cook me another delicious homemade meal the next day, and I accepted. I didn't even realize I was falling for his charm. He came the next day around dinner time and made something good again. We ended up talking way past curfew. And he ended up sleeping at my house. I know what you're all thinking, but we didn't sleep together. He slept in a different room and on a different bed. It became a routine, Harris coming over to my place, cooking me dinner, and us having conversations about things we normally or usually don't discuss with other people. He even told me once that he'd come here for a short-term gig and that he'd met Chloe. She knew he was leaving, so she deliberately got pregnant, which led to him staying longer. I also told him the real reason I'd hired him, Chloe's bullying and my revenge. One evening, as usual, we had dinner and a chat. My husband texted me to say he was going to call me on video call in 10 minutes. He was teasing me, telling me to wear something sexy. I had to let Harris leave because I didn't want Austin asking questions, so I told him I had to do something important and would see him the next day. Well, I opened the door and when he was outside waving goodbye, he grabbed the door handle to stop me from pushing it to lock and kissed me. I was surprised and couldn't react, but the ringtone of my phone jolted me into action, and I pushed him away and then locked the door. I told him something important and said I'd see him the next day. Well, I opened the door and when he was outside waving goodbye, he grabbed the door handle to stop me from pushing it to lock and kissed me. I was surprised and couldn't react, but the ringtone of my phone jolted me into action, and I pushed him away and locked the door. I was so shocked that I couldn't react. Throughout my video call with my husband, I was very distracted, thinking about the kiss. Austin even noticed I was distracted and asked me about it. I told him it was work-related, and we spoke for another 25 minutes before Austin said goodnight. After that, I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about the kiss and asking myself different questions as to why Harris would have kissed me when he knew I was married, and that he had a baby coming with his girlfriend the next day. I tried to avoid him as much as I could. In fact, I didn't even complain about the shoots. I just wanted to stay as far away from him as possible. I didn't want to cheat on my husband because I loved Austin. That evening, Harris came over and I told him I'd already ordered pizza and wasn't hungry. I wanted to rest, so I made excuses and he left. I avoided Harris for a week, but it wasn't easy as we worked together and he was trying. It was hard to focus on anything other than Harris. I was noticing things I hadn't before, like his abs and the way his smile lit up his whole face. One time he was filming a water advertisement, drinking water to make sure it looked right. I was so thirsty I felt like I could lick the water off his chest. I quickly realized what I was doing and left early that day. I was sexually frustrated and at that point I hated that Austin wasn't with me. I was in that situation because if I had my husband by my side, maybe I wouldn't be lusting after another man. One night I was mugged. They made away with all the money and jewelry I had. I wasn't bothered about the amount of money they took, and neither did the jewelry bother me because I could replace them all if I wanted to. I was really scared to stay in the house on my own, because when they first came in, one of them hit me on the head with the edge of the gun. I fainted before I was even awake. By the time I was conscious again, they had already left. I called Austin, but it was his secretary who answered. She told me how caught up with work he was. I was told to tell him I said hi instead of what I wanted to say. I didn't want to disturb him anymore because I knew he would probably abandon work and come running to me, which would mean losing a significant amount of money. So I called the closest person to me, which was Harris. He came. He told me he was really worried when I called. I hugged him and asked if Chloe knew he was with me. He said no, that she was asleep. He stayed with me at home all night. By the time it was morning, his phone was blowing up with calls from Chloe. He picked up. He said he had to run an errand in town and left early so he wouldn't wake her up and start panicking that he was leaving. Even to me, the story he made up sounded pathetic, but Chloe seemed to believe him and wished him a safe trip before dropping the call. I couldn't believe he lied to her like that, the mother of his unborn child, because of me, which was really touching because apart from my husband, no one had ever stood up for me. He was basically defending me in my head, which felt like he was standing up for me, which obviously wasn't the case, but I wasn't listening to my brain at that point, just my heart. I kissed him, and I pulled his face into my palm. I guess you can probably guess what happened next. We slept together that day. After that, I felt really guilty because I had cheated on my husband. I still loved Austin a lot. Harris confronted me when he realized I had been avoiding him again. I gave him some excuses, but he didn't believe me. I made excuses, but he didn't buy them. Eventually, we had sex again. We kept up the affair. Harris was so addictive. He had a way with his hands that made me think of Austin as a good husband, but not good enough for me. Chloe didn't suspect a thing. She thought of me as her good friend. Chloe was always telling me things, sometimes about the baby or about Harris. I started getting jealous whenever she told me Harris bought her a few things because it's my money originally, and I pay Harris for working with me and some extra tips I gave him whenever he had money issues. Harris never bought me anything. I didn't mind at first because I could buy myself anything I wanted, but it started to bother me when Chloe told me that Harris bought her gifts every time he came home. I knew I had no right to be jealous, but I couldn't help feeling that way. I started to insist that Harris spent more than a few hours with me, so most of the time he was always at my place. But that changed when Austin came along. Austin had put his business on hold to be with me. I was happy to see him because he'd come to where we were shooting. Harris and I were shooting a few sets of clothing. I was so surprised. I was surprised to see him. He hugged and kissed me right there in front of everyone. I saw Harris looking jealous throughout the remaining photo sessions. Austin was there, and whenever I had a break, he was right beside me, giving me water or wiping off the sweat that had gathered on my forehead. All the photography equipment Harris had kept to himself was clearly not pleased with the whole situation. Before I had any chance to see Harris again, it was another week. That was because Austin made sure he didn't leave my side. I didn't exactly see him, but I couldn't talk to him. I had to keep it on the down low because Austin was around, and we couldn't hang out at my place like we did before. So I got together with the team for a little celebration party, but I told Austin it was just for us. I didn't want to bring my husband along because I thought it might intimidate people. I made sure everyone had plenty to drink and eat. Harris barely touched his food or drink, and just looked like he was desperate to leave the place when I was sure everyone was tipsy, some very drunk. I made my move. I sent him a text to meet me in the bathroom and said he should leave in about 2 minutes after I'd left the table. I waited for him, and when he eventually did show up, I apologized for the previous week and us not seeing each other. He seemed jealous and just told me he didn't like how Austin kept touching and he was kissing me like I was his property, and I joked that I was, but Harris got even more mad. I calmed him down, and we kissed and made up before I left the bathroom. He left a few minutes after I left too. Don't get me wrong, I loved my husband Austin very much, but I liked Harris, especially because he was better at sex than Austin was. I regret it now, but at the time I was not thinking clearly and just wanted it all, Austin's financial security and his love, and Harris for his sexual prowess. Well, I guess no secrets can be kept for that long, as mine were also actually discovered. Or should I say that it had been discovered long before I thought it would be? Jason was the guy who drove me around. He was mostly silent and always watching people. I had always dismissed him as an ordinary guy and paid him no attention. But apparently he had been hired by my husband to protect me and report back to him about anything unusual he noticed around me, or about me. I didn't even know that. And apparently to be able to drive me home, Jason had sat at another table and ordered drinks but didn't touch them. He had noticed Harris following me. He went into the bathroom and followed us. He recorded our conversation and apparently reported to his boss about Harris visiting and the sleepovers he'd been having. I guess the record he made of us was enough for Austin to confront me. I was taken aback at first, then I laughed and tried to cover it up with a joke. I was actually joking with Harris that night. The funny thing is Austin believed me, but I was so nervous and couldn't keep my mouth shut. I was trying to cover loose ends, and joked that if I'd been cheating on him with Harris, it would have been because Harris was younger and his sexual prowess would have been impressive. I was only joking about it, but Austin just looked at me and left. I tried calling and texting him, but he wouldn't respond. The next thing I got was a sealed document. When I opened it, I saw that it was a divorce paper, and that it had already been signed by one party. I tried to reach out to Austin, but it was impossible because my cards had been blocked, so I had no access to my account, or, for that matter, Austin's accounts. I really need your advice, guys. I cannot afford to lose. Austin, I love you very much. Please update me. Hello, Reddit. I'm pregnant with Harris's child because of our affair. I don't even have enough money to have an abortion. I had to sell my father's house, where I stayed before, to cater to my needs and the needs of the unborn child. I'm a failed mother already. I had to move to a smaller apartment with the money. I sold my expensive dresses to get cheaper ones that could accommodate my growing belly. Harris moved in with me and Chloe too. We all live together now, and it's been pretty frustrating. I've had to put up with Chloe's snickers and barely concealed hatred, even when she's around. Every day is a struggle. Harris blames me for everything, and Chloe is taking advantage of the money I have left. I feel terrible for losing the one person who cared about me and taught me so much. I was proud to think I'd already turned those hurts into strength. When I came back home, I fell into a sick, twisted revenge plot that landed me in a worse situation than I'd ever been in. I regret everything, every day as a reminder. I took what I had for granted because I was reckless. I didn't appreciate what I had because I thought I deserved more. Now I've lost it and I can't get it back. I can't even put into words how awful I feel every day. I keep wishing I had never come here or just left after I had the chance to attend my mother's burial. But I didn't take it. Now I don't even have the option of leaving. My life is just totally ruined. Hello Reddit, this is my last post here. I just wanted to thank you for reading my story. I know how true it is, and I appreciate all your comments about me. I'm a terrible person who will always regret losing a good man. I'm in a dark place, and everything reminds me of how stupid I was. My growing belly and the little kicks I feel remind me every day that I'm going to be a mother soon. I'd be a mother. It scares me because I never had a good mother, and with what I did to Austin, I don't think I have any chance of being even a fairly good mother to my unborn child. I'm sorry guys, but I really do think it's worth learning from my mistake. Thanks and goodbye.